Welcome, everyone. Hello, friends. Welcome to San Francisco Theological Seminary. My name is Scott Clark, and I'm the chaplain and the dean of students here. I want to welcome you and also to convey on behalf of the seminary how very excited and honored we are to have folks from ACSWP, the Advisory Committee on Social Witness Policy. Did I get it right? Here with us. I know a lot of people in the room are Presbyterian, and some of you may not be, but ACSWP is an important and an essential prophetic voice within the Presbyterian Church USA denomination. If you've ever been to a General Assembly and in so many other venues, they are out there speaking and working on behalf of justice. So we couldn't be any more excited to have them here to have this important conversation about #MeToo movement. And so that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to give it over to many much more important voices and hand it over to my dear friend, Reverend Beverly Brewster.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. Yes, so I am so happy and honored to be here with all of you today. I want to say thank you to San Francisco Theological Seminary for hosting this and co-sponsoring this panel. Also for giving me my life really here as an MDiv. I would have to say I think SFTS was a life-giving experience for me. And I want to also thank our panelists and our ACSWP. If you are on the ACSWP coordinator or elected member, please raise your hand.
We're meeting here now.
Yes. So the Advisory Committee for Social Witness Policy, wonderful. And thanks to all the rest of you who are here. Oh, you want me to do this? Thank you. Everybody, is it on you? Can you hear me now? Okay, good. So thank you to SFTS. Thank you for hosting the ACSWP, and thank you to our panelists. So I was going to briefly introduce our panelists, but I first, after saying welcome and thank you, I'll just say a very brief word about myself. So in addition to being an SFTS MDiv, I'm a local pastor at Sleepy Hollow Presbyterian Church. I'm in my 8th year there across town on the other side of San Anselmo. And I would just have to say that that I know from my own experience that these #MeToo issues are very difficult in the church. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists today about the complexity and the intersectionality of these issues and how all of us, pastors in the pews, everyone associated, everyone who loves the church is very deeply affected by these issues. So, yes, so I'm going to introduce our 4 panelists, and then each of them has about 5 minutes of intro, and then we'll go a little bit, we'll see where we've turned up something that's too hot to pass up that we have to go back to right away, and then we'll have plenty of time for your questions and comments. So that's our plan for this really exciting hour and a half that we're going to have together. So just to set us in a context, I was just seeing in today's Washington Post that exit polls from Tuesday's election show that 84% of those polled think that sexual harassment is a really big problem, right? And actually 78% thought that, felt very strongly that more women should be elected to positions of power. And then I was sort of amazed to see that only 47% disapproved of the elevation of Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. But still, 47 to 44. So we're in an interesting place in our society. So I'm going to introduce the panelists in this order, but then they're going to start their opening remarks in slightly different order. But right here on my left, we have Reverend Dr. Teresa Chávez-Sauceda, who is former associate for racial justice and advocacy for the PCUSA. Was that 2003 to 2008? Yes. And you have your PhD from the GTU, your MDiv from Austin. That's still okay. And you are currently Director of Advanced Pastoral Studies and Assistant Professor of Ministry here at SFTS. Thank you and bless you. What a ministry. You have experience as a hospice minister and a lot of experience with community ministry with newcomers, Latino, Latina, and immigrants in San Francisco's Mission District. You are parish associate at Community Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh.
So lots of pastoral and parish experience. So thank you for joining the panel today, Teresa. On your left is my colleague, Sylvia Thorson-Smith, of the Advisory Committee on Social Witness Policy. Sylvia was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska. I didn't even know that till you sent me your bio. And you received your MA in Sociology and Women's Studies from Wichita State, and taught there from 78 to 85, and was the educator of Planned Parenthood of Southern Kansas back in the 80s.
Yay, Kansas for a while.
Right.
Doing this week. Yeah.
Yay, Kansas. Yeah, that's right. No. You don't say yay, Kansas very often? Ann Coulter tweeted, "Kansas is dead to me now." And so, as Sylvia served on the Council on Women in the Church of the Presbyterian Church USA in the 80s, coordinated a denominational study on pornography for the PCUSA, and wrote and edited the report, Pornography, Far from the Song of Songs. She served on the GA Special Committee on Human Sexuality from 88 to 91, and wrote and edited the 91 report, Keeping Body and Soul Together, Sexuality, Spirituality, and Social Justice. A lot of heart in that. Infamous report. Well, it made you infamous, I guess. Sylvia has co-edited 2 books, Called Out With, Stories of Solidarity with LGBT Persons, and Body and Soul, Rethinking Sexuality as Justice Love. She's now retired in Tucson, Arizona, active member of St. Mark's Presbyterian Church, great church, and serves on the ACSWP and is our liaison to the Advocacy Committee for Women's Concerns. Fantastic. Thank you and welcome, Sylvia. Also from the Advocacy Committee for Women's Concerns is our next panelist on Sylvia's left, so that would be Jeanne Choy Tate. And you're co-coordinator now of Advocacy Committee for Women's Concerns, and you're an SFTS grad. Jeanne's a PhD from the GTU in Religion and Psychology and a commissioned lay pastor. She came to the West Coast to Cameron House, Presbyterian National Mission, at age 19 as a live-in volunteer in mission, and has spent 16 years involved in the work of Cameron House to heal from 30 years of the former director's abuse, sexual misconduct. She's current co-moderator of the Advisory Committee for Women's Concerns, which successfully got passed a comprehensive package at the 2018 GA, which we really want to hear about the 2018 GA's response to raising this issue of sexual misconduct in the church. So we welcome you and thank you for being here. And at the far end, there is my CPE supervisor, Reverend Dr. Laurie Garrett-Cobbina. Thank you for being here. Laurie is the Shaw Family Chair for Clinical Pastoral Education and Assistant Professor of Pastoral Care and Education here at SFTS. Joined the faculty here in 2006. She's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, served in many capacities, including solo pastor of Smallwood Presbyterian Church in Charlotte. Laurie has served hospitals as CPE educator and chaplain in Indianapolis, San Francisco, and Charlotte. Her interdisciplinary studies and research have focused on education and pastoral care, more specifically the effect of grief, trauma, and narrative on educational attainment. So her husband is Chaplain Michael Cobbina, and she, who is from Takoradi, Ghana. So, and Laurie, thank you for being here. Thank you for being my CPE supervisor. Thank you for all the ministers you launched into the world.
I should thank you for being such a wonderful, wonderful learner.
Oh my gosh, soaking it up. So that's what we're going to do here today. We're going to soak it up, and you know, if you just, I just want to say this. Okay, this can be a very uncomfortable territory for many of us. And I mean, you know, we read about people getting triggered and whatever. If you feel like something's making you uncomfortable, feel free to get up, go to the back of the room, pound on the table, you know, ask for help, whatever, because this is sensitive terrain. This is holy ground and it's sensitive terrain. And, you know, to me, I mean, the reason I'm not a lawyer anymore, but I'm a minister, is because I think of Jesus as the great healer. And we know that Jesus is with us in healing in this transformational journey. But this can be a very difficult journey. So we want to hold these, our dear panelists here, and really hold them in light as they share some of their personal experience and their knowledge, and then also just be in a really state of solidarity here with everyone in this room who has suffered from any kind of sexual misconduct or any kind of power abuse, and with all those who we know and love, and those we don't yet know and love who have suffered. So with that in our hearts and minds, let's go forward. Okay, so Sylvia's going to set a frame for us because we said #MeToo, believing in women's equality. So Sylvia.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I should remove the mic or just pull it.
That's not, you can just leave.
Okay, I just leave it and get close, I guess.
I think I'll turn it up for you if you need.
Okay, if you can't hear me, raise your hand. But first of all, I just want to start by saying how delighted I am to be on this campus. I'm really getting my exercise on the hills, and I live in Tucson, Arizona, and this is just a beautiful, I even put on Facebook that there are real leaves here. That was really fun to see, real leaves and deer. I mean, that was very cool. But even more than that, walking around here, my husband is an alum, Mike Smith of SFTS. He was a graduate here 52 years ago. He's a lot older than I am. 52 years ago, Mike was walking around here, and I just think that's sort of sacred ground for me. And I want to thank the seminary so much for hosting this panel and giving me an opportunity and the rest of us an opportunity to talk about this topic of Me Too, believing in women's equality. And I'd like to begin with a biblical story. This is from the longer ending to Mark 16. Now, after Jesus rose on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. They would not believe her. And then I'd like to move forward to about 2,000 years to another experience of a woman, and listen to the words of Anita Hill that she spoke after the Kavanaugh hearing. She said, "In many ways, the Kavanaugh hearings did feel like a repeat of 1991. The process is his word against hers. You'd hope the two parties would come together as equals. You'd hope. But members of the Judiciary Committee had made it known that they didn't think Dr. Christine Blasey Ford was being truthful. And you have public statements by the president that suggest she's lying. Someone came in with much more power to be heard." And Anita Hill goes on, "What I really want people to understand is that everyone who comes forward is different. So every experience is different, and that needs to be held and understood." And then she says, "The hierarchy of who is believed is complicated." And I just want to add to this that I read something just a day or two ago that Dr. Ford is still living with threats. She is still being terrorized by people who are threatening her. And Judge Kavanaugh sits on the highest court in the land. That makes me ask, what is at stake here? Why are people still terrorizing this woman? I think that's an important question to ask and to think about. So I think we can learn some important lessons from Mary Magdalene's time to the present. Number one, historically, women are routinely not believed, whether they have extraordinary sightings to report, and especially if they're making accusations against men. And The hierarchy of who is believed is indeed complicated and riddled with power arrangements. What it will take for two parties, as Anita Hill suggests, to come together as equals, what will it take when one is a woman and one is a man? When the issue between them is the institution in which they are a part of, and that is the church. When gender is only one of many factors that complicate these hierarchies of power. Anita Hill notes that her experience not only had to do with both race and gender, but also with education. She is a very educated woman, and so was Dr. Ford. And Anita Hill says that should have worked, education in the power hierarchy should have worked in her favor, but it was turned against her. And think about Dr. Ford and those hearings and how she spoke so freely and easily out of her educated understanding of psychology and the brain and trauma. And that was just made fun of. It was dismissed like she just is talking about something that we don't understand and will not even recognize. So I just want to say, if you want to read a superb book about the Anita Hill-Clarence Thomas conflict, I highly recommend Racing Justice, Engendering Power. It's edited by Toni Morrison, and it's a fabulous collection of very diverse analyses of the intersection of race and gender and class that happened in that whole Anita Hill-Clarence Thomas event. I think the experiences of women, particularly their experiences of sexual harassment and assault, will continue to be disbelieved until we grapple with the relationship between women and power. And I'm going to come back to that, but that's my little intro.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you. So when we talk about who's believed and then, how this intersects with these complex power relationships and dynamics, someone who's been grappling with that lately is Jeanne, who in her capacity as co-coordinator at ACWC had a lot to do with what happened in this area at the GA 2018 just in June. And you also have a really fascinating life story that expands the survivor universe beyond women. So Jeanne, we'd love to hear from you. Oh, I forgot to mic.
I'm so sorry. Could everybody hear a little bit of what? Okay.
Can you hear me? I came to Cameron House when I was 19 years old. Cameron House it still is a community center in Chinatown, but it was a national mission of the Presbyterian Church for decades. It was actually the premier youth program of the denomination. The pastor there was considered highly charismatic. He was considered a national leader. He sent 30 men into the pastorate, no women, but 30 men. And 10 years after he retired in 1987, rumors began to circulate about his abuse and sexual misconduct over his 30-year tenure. In all, 40 victims eventually came forward. We suspect there are hundreds, but we have 40 who came forward. At that time, the Presbytery began an investigative process and found 9 victims and was about to bring charges when the pastor renounced jurisdiction. At that point, the Presbytery considers its work done. Even though the case has not been closed at all, no charges have ever been found, and the congregation and the community is left wondering who to believe. And believe me, the pastor still continued to press his narrative about how he was not an abuser. And so families split, the congregation split. There were those who believed him, there were those who believed the victims, and I'm telling you this because this is a common story in almost every congregation this happens in. Pastors who abuse have the pulpit to use as their way to put down their victims. They have the colleagues at the Presbytery who are close to them, who are reluctant to question their own relationship with that person, who don't want to believe that clergy can abuse. All of these things contribute to the power of a pastor to abuse. In this case, the pastor, I'm not sure what order to do these things in, but the pastor had many congregation members who still called him Dad and Grandpa Dick. 20 years after he renounced a jurisdiction, our Presbyterian exec and the victim's therapist visited him to see if he would take any responsibility for his actions. They were confused by the experience. It was very disoriented because in one sentence he would take responsibility for doing anything, he would deny doing anything wrong. In the next sentence he would say things like, Chinese are very sexually repressed. Chinese men aren't able to show their affection. I would give them what they couldn't get at home. Or I'm a hugger. If I'm pressing against someone and they get aroused, well, that happens sometimes. I was intimate with him so he would confide his problems in me. It's not sex unless it's ejaculation. You can see how the person spins a narrative that they even start to believe themselves. 13 years after he renounced jurisdiction, it became apparent that something was wrong in the community still. The abuse stood like an elephant in the center of the room. And with great courage, in 2002, the board of Cameron House formed a healing task force that I was invited to sit on. 16 years later, we are still doing that healing work. We are now in the process of developing curriculum materials that we hope other congregations can use so that they can learn from our experience. We learned that sexual abuse does not just impact the victim, it impacts their families, it impacts their friends, it impacts the congregation. And it does not just impact you physically and emotionally, it impacts your whole spiritual life. And all of those things need to be healed. At the time, my husband never thought of himself as a victim until the nightmares began. And he eventually came to recover the memory of being a 13-year-old and being coerced into oral sex in the downstairs room while the rest of the youth prayed in worship over his head. I was asked to focus.
Well, actually, let's rest there. Okay. Come back to you to honor them. We're going to come back to you on those and go to Laurie right now, who really has a tremendous background in healing, trauma, and grief. And so maybe, and also as a pastor, and then as a hospital chaplain and hospital chaplain supervisor, and just somebody who knows the church well, here being from all angles, being in the seminary, can speak to those pieces.
I'm going to speak right now out of some of my dissertation. So it's not in probably a good order for what I want to present, but I just want to highlight some of the intersectionality of race and gender and sexual orientation in particular. Because of, the Kavanaugh hearings, one thing that I wrote about is how policing gender boundaries and behaviors for women has always been an important legislative activity. At governments, general assemblies, local and federal policymakers, policing the boundaries and behaviors of women, and also African Americans, also LGBTQ, has been a significant and ongoing legislative goal. And you have to think the beginning of legislating behavior for women began back at the beginning of the biblical story, in the beginning of the creation of theology. Theology was created to underscore the submission of women and the dominance of men. And so it's a very difficult narrative to overcome because so many people buy into it. So in this, anytime anybody white buys into racism, particularly white women who are racist or buy into racist ideology, they're contributing to their own abuse. Because the abuse of, say, black women historically, particularly through the slave system, when actually there wasn't a definition of rape of a black woman, because white men had unrestricted access to black bodies, as well as to yellow bodies and other bodies that were oppressed on these lands, red bodies. And so the idea that a white woman was safe just meant she couldn't tell her story. That's what it meant. So when I think of this Me Too movement, it's this courage that has come, I think, for white women, because the stories of women of color have not been paid attention to, or either they're not actual abuse, because there was no way to abuse a black woman's body, legislatively, legally, and also theologically. So quite brutal measures are created to make sure that a certain segment of society can act out sort of their shadow side, their unconscious side, their violent side, and that these practices are made sort of like an archetypical shadow violence that is permissible. Probably the only kind of abuse that's as old as the sort of theological, physical abuse of women is the abuse of children. And so when we say we don't want children to be abused, but we are permissive in setting up contexts like at the Cameron House where children are abused. So just like the children who have been taken away from their parents at the borders, you know those children are being abused. I mean, you can't pretend like you don't know. Not just physically abused, but they're being sexually abused. Because these are the legislative permissive acts that somehow as a society we have said we can live with that. And so the thing that complicates all of this is in sort of the poorly kept secret, especially around violence against the bodies of women of color, is that there were all kind of laws that said that there shouldn't be sex between black and white people. But look at me. Nothing could be legislated to stop this kind of culture of rape against the bodies of black women. And we're all very intricately connected through our households, through doing laundry and doing dishes and having meals together, and we're all very intricately connected, which makes it difficult if you're racialized white to take a stand against your partner if your partner is racialized white. So it's a complicated intersection. It's an intimate intersection. It's also a violent intersection. It's supported by theology, and it's supported by law. So you see how complicated this issue can become. And what happens is that grief and trauma and terror are generated not just because the acts are grievous and traumatizing and terrorizing, because the process of dealing with grief and trauma and terror make it difficult to heal before the next trauma comes. So you're still trying to process the grief and the trauma. So maybe you've regained your memories, you've joined a support group, you've got a therapist, you're starting to work on your trauma, and then you get traumatized again. And so we have layers of trauma. And this isn't to speak about what happens to the I'm going to use the word soul, but the moral body of the one who's perpetrating the trauma. What is happening to that soul? What is happening what happens to the person who's causing or perpetrating the moral injury? It's as if that person is off the hook. And I think that needs to be looked at a little closer to really understand the consequences of, and in the church we would say the consequences of sin. But if we have theology and legislation that says it's not a sin and it's okay, and there's actually supposed to be a certain hierarchy of reign, then I wonder what that says about our relationship with God, but also our ability to hold accountable or even understand what sin is or what the church is. Is the church that has a whole misogynist theology? Is that the church? Can that be the church? Can the church be the church that has a whole racist rhetoric? So are we the church? Are we actually Christians? Or are we sort of outside looking, trying to figure out how to ameliorate the sin of one, our terror, and then the other, the terrorizer, so that we can actually create a community that has the ability to interact with God?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. There's so much to think about, and I know probably all of you have a lot of questions percolating, but we're going to give Teresa a chance. And and I think what Laurie said actually really does segue to you, Teresa, because my understanding of your job here at SFTS is that pastors or people go out from here or other seminaries with their MDiv, become ordained and installed, serve as pastors, and then they come back to you after a few years working in the church and to get their DMin. Is that right? So you're getting people who are probably really grappling with the on the ground, in the field questions that Laurie was just raising about, are we really the church when we're living with this racist rhetoric, when we're living with this misogyny, when we're living with this patriarchal theology, where we can't really untangle the patriarchy from the sacred scripture, from the sacred text? So we would love to hear from you, from the vantage point of the training pastors, and supporting pastors who've been in the field, and many of whom may come to you with their own stories of misconduct in the church.
Well, to answer that last point, I haven't had students in particular. But I will say the Doctor of Ministry program here at SFTS is a very ecumenical and even interfaith program. We've had a number of Jewish rabbis, including women. We have women in denominations who don't ordain women, but they are serving in places of ministry, and so are admitted in our program. We've widened that classic definition of Doctor of Ministry to include people who aren't ordained. I certainly hear from my students the realities of disparate treatment and less than equal position in the church across the board. Whether it's feeling the need to justify, as a pastor, the multiple responsibilities of family, along with career and all of that. Questions about where my support comes from, who are my colleagues, so the realities of gender disparity are very real and from what I see and from what I hear from my students, are across the board in the church writ large. In my reflections for this panel, there are some things that I've focused on that kind of pull out some of the threads of what we've heard. And some of my own personal reflections on what has changed from the 1980s when I was doing some of the first prevention of sexual harassment training for the Internal Revenue Service, and the church was developing sexual misconduct policies. What is changed and what is different in the Me Too movement? And I think one of the things is, in some ways, the way we ourselves as women think about these issues and the ways that we would hope for change, maybe. So, an illustration. I went to seminary in 1985 as a second career student. We were the first class at Austin to have a significant number of women and a significant number of second career students. And there were a group of us that started meeting on Friday afternoons just to sort of debrief the week and what was happening, and in some places the challenges we were confronting because the institution wasn't used to having so many female voices in the classroom. And the questions we asked weren't the ones they were accustomed to hearing sometimes. Eventually, we invited a woman who was also an Austin alum, ordained pastor and serving a church in Austin, to come meet with us, and served in some ways as a mentor, kind of facilitator, convener, and just brought a perspective from someone in ministry. And I remember her at one point sharing a story from her own experience where she had been raped in her office in the church. And what I remembered about that conversation was the pain and the anguish she expressed over her struggle with her pastoral identity, of how do I respond and how do I act for this man who is a parishioner. What is my responsibility to him as his pastor? And it was 30 years ago. I don't remember all of the conversation. But I think, I would hope that today we would start that conversation from a different place. And that what is in the tenor of the Me Too movement is being at a place where we're wanting to say, we're wanting to demand zero tolerance. And not just believe us, but don't blame us for being female, because that's the way God made us. Another thing that was happening in the 1980s that points to an issue today, particularly as we think about the role of the church and the responsibility of the church, and where do we need to go in terms of our own policies and our own accountabilities. In the 1980s, companies that owned major buildings stopped hiring their own janitorial staff and started working with contractors. Fast forward to the early 2000s, where a number of women began to file lawsuits against the world's largest janitorial company in the world. Some of you may have seen the documentary. There we go. Rape on the Night Shift.
Oh, yes.
Particularly for those of us in California, this has been covered extensively by Reveal, the Center for Investigative Journalism, and the California Report on National Public Radio. So I don't know how widely the California Report gets broadcast elsewhere. There have been a number of cases, individual cases and collective cases filed. One of the things I learned in going back and looking this up to refresh my memory is that one of the first cases was filed by a woman who worked by herself in a church in Bakersfield. And she was raped by her supervisor, whose job it was to make regular rotations every night and check in on employees. This is a common circumstance of these cases. Many of these women are Latina immigrants, and many of them are undocumented. They have little recourse to ask for help. This is also one of the first cases that was taken up by Time's Up, which is the legal defense fund that was announced in conjunction really with the emergence of the Me Too movement. And it expresses this same sentiment that if things have not changed with 30 years of laws and policies and training, the next step is a zero tolerance and an absolute standard. So, but what that also says to us, I think, as a church, is that we need to go beyond policies of misconduct that relate to pastors in churches and to look at our entire structure, to look at and how we interface with other corporate entities and what kinds of responsibility do we have there, in the same way that we do on a lot of other issues in the church. That's a good start, okay. There was one point, and I will want to make quick because I think it's important. One of the ways that this panel was framed was to think about questions of entitlement and how do we address that. And I think what we've also learned in this issue particularly, but in issues around race and many others, that we can look at structures and we can try to make inroads in changing the structure. We can change laws, we can change policies, we can require training. But the deep change we need is a change in culture and in identity. And that change is very hard to make. I don't have any answers, but I think we have to take that very, very seriously, or we'll be here 30 years from now having a very similar conversation.
Thank you very much. And that is I'm really glad you made that last point. That is because we did put in the, description of this panel that we were going to look at the sense of entitlement by some that excuses or enables assault on the selfhood of others. And if we don't get to that root cause of abuse and misconduct, you're right, right? So I thought we could hear from Sylvia and Jeanne, and you decide who wants to go first on where the Presbyterian Church USA is right now on addressing this through ACWC's hard work, because you're both very active.
Let Jeanne speak to that.
Okay.
I have a couple of things I was going to add
to
my preface to what I
Okay,
said.
whichever one of you feels called to speak first.
Why don't you follow up with that, and then I'll come back to yeah, because this is a intersection church issue.
In our 16 years of working with the denomination on this issue, not much has changed. Nothing, well, I won't say nothing. This last GA was more positive than ever. I think the voice of victims is starting to be heard. The experience of the victims of Cameron House was that often in working with the denomination, it was re-traumatizing. It more often added to their sense of woundedness than not. That is partly because the church is an institution, and institutions are self-protective. They want to maintain their stability, and they are going to do everything they can to do that. And it's a hidden motive. It sounds nice that they're going to come out and support the victims, but if you really look at the structure, structurally it is not there. Because it would be too challenging to what the denomination is. Currently, the work of the denomination divides, to the extent that it recognizes sexual misconduct, is divided between the OGA and the PMA. That in itself is very confusing. There's staff on both sides that don't communicate with each other. It's not clear what programs are where. And the focus is on legal counsel and insurance providers. If you go to the website, it was designed to let presbyteries protect themselves in the judicial process. It was not designed to help victims. The denomination, my husband just got so angry at the last Presbyterian Today because it had a big ad for a sexual abuse hotline. He called it. It's an insurance provider. They contract it to an insurance provider. He got a receptionist who knows nothing about sexual abuse, and unless he could say what department he wanted to speak to, she could provide him with no help. That's the state today. At this last GA, there were 6 overtures on clergy sexual misconduct that came before the GA. 5 of these overtures had been through subsequent GAs, recycled, and that's what we do. The last GA approved some things that were so confusing that they had to redo them this GA, and 3 of those overtures were on the renunciation of jurisdiction. And I spoke to a little bit earlier about how pastors who have renounced jurisdiction are either still talking to members of the congregation and saying, well, why don't I come back and just help with this and this and this, or they move to a new presbytery and they try to come back in again. And that's what these overtures have been about churches and presbyteries saying, oh, please let these pastors come back. We want to use their skills again. I think this year it was finally heard that this is a repetitive problem that we cannot condone. And those overtures will be coming for approval to the presbyteries. ACWC had its own overture, which was a comprehensive approach to, I hope, since I wrote it, to clergy sexual misconduct. To date, there has been at the last GA a task force approved called the Safe and Sacred Task Force. That some of the members have resigned from that task force because the staff they have worked with have been so protective of the institution. But it's also that what we have tended to do is do things for victims rather than let victims do things for themselves and say where the church needs to change. And so we are creating a 5-member task force to victims and victim advocates. We still don't know who's going to staff it, which is a big problem, which could be a big problem again. But it's hopeful. It also recognizes that not just individuals, but families and congregations need resources, and they need theological resources, and they need spiritual resources, and they need protection through the judicial process, which is grueling for a victim to go through the Presbyterian process. You may not be aware, but an allegation against the pastor who has committed abuse does not become an allegation until after the judicial process is complete. Before that, it's not an allegation because it hasn't been proven yet. So that seems crazy. Let's see what else.
I did promise you I was going to say your quote in Presbyterian Today. So, I think a lot of times we as clergy or just maybe, I'll get a show of hands. Who in here identifies as a Presbyterian? Or, okay. So we're not being too hostile in talking about General Assembly and our Presbyterian process and all this. I just wanted to make sure that we know this is mostly an audience of people who are connected to or interested in the Presbyterian Church USA. But I do think that, I think we're all pretty aware of the grand jury report that came down in Pennsylvania and the sort of scope of the clergy sexual misconduct in the Roman Catholic Church. And I have many, many Roman Catholic friends here in San Anselmo who said, well, we're going to come to your church now. I mean, they're just really have about had it, right? So Presbyterian, I think as Presbyterians, we haven't, maybe we've been able to feel like we didn't have quite such a big problem. But when Presbyterians today asked Jeanne, what is the scope of our problem with sexual misconduct? She was quoted as saying, well, how would we know, right? How would we know? Because we really haven't done systematically tried to figure out what the scope of our problem is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you may not be aware that the denomination collects no statistics on sexual misconduct. It says it cannot ask the presbyteries because it's confidential in the presbyteries, and it would be, they can't ask. So that was one of the things that came down in this overture that we're the most excited about, if it happens. I'm still waiting, that we would finally collect aggregate statistics on sexual misconduct. It protects the church to not know that it's occurring. That's all I have to say.
All right. We're going to get to your questions in just a moment, but Sylvia's got a few things.
But Steve, did you want
Well, just on this point, I mean, if there is a sexual misconduct situation that happens, and the person, whether it's a pastor or a lay person, leaves, how do we take responsibility to do anything to make sure that this person just doesn't go somewhere else? I mean, it's partly with this pastor pronouncing jurisdiction, but even if it happens with a lay person, how do you make sure that this problem just doesn't?
Well, there is nothing for a layperson. There is, in recent years, technically presbyteries are supposed to connect with each other. I mean, the clerk is supposed to connect with the clerk of another presbytery that the person goes to. Whether it happens or not, I don't know.
But there will be a process where
But
if someone...
there's no list, this person has been, that you can go to and say, oh, is this person on the list? No, there's no list.
Sylvia, did you want to follow that up?
Yeah.
We'll get to questions.
I have on both a number of different hats. I'm trained as a sociologist. I taught at Grinnell College in sociology, in gender and women's studies, and in religious studies. I'm very interdisciplinary, but I come at this, and I think my voice on this panel is to really look at these issues that are the third point, and Teresa was talking about that too. I think we all have sort of touched on it. This sense of entitlement. I do think that we have to deal with the substance, the specific issues, and how to address them, both constitutionally and through the legislative process of the church. But I think we also need to look at the bigger picture of the cultural picture, and like Laurie was saying about our theology and these overarching values that give us a worldview and that give us a sense of how we live in the world. So I just want to say, I wanted to lift up a little more about women in power. I get New York Magazine. If any of you see this, it's online. I get New York Magazine because I like all the cultural stuff about, that's my sort of a way of going to New York without being there. So I got an email from them, and they said, how did you like this whole cover story and a big feature on women and power? And so they're asking people out there to say, what is this whole phenomenon of women coming into their voice and the Me Too experience, but also just issues of women in power. And they have one of the things that starts out, it says, in 2018, there is no earthly reason, biological or otherwise, why men should have more power than women. And I think we have to ask that. What are our power inequalities and hierarchies throughout not only society, but throughout the church? At ACWC last week, I'm a liaison, we spent a whole day talking about the white domination system and how the church is an institution that is built on that, and how white women, I appreciate what Laurie said, how white women functioning within this system And women of color, I think we need to look at that, and also the diversity of sexuality and sexual identity. We just need to examine this whole structure of power inequality a whole lot more. And what's funny to me is this whole New York Magazine that comes, Women in Power. And the very first national event that I went to, Teresa talks about the 80s, in the 70s, it was about 1977 or 8, and it was on women and power in the Presbyterian Church. And it was like, I remember thinking, wow, we're talking about this P word as though we've never ever talked about it before. And here in 2018, I think we have to look at why this phenomenon. Let me just quote something from Maureen Dowd, who says, the word Kavanaugh, think of this as a noun or even a verb. The word Kavanaugh is meant to evoke the fear that aggrieved women will hurtle out of the past to tear down men and their rightful perches of privilege. Kavanaugh has become a code word for white male hegemony. And I think that's one thing we need to look at. But what I wanted to share with you, just a couple of things. I've got a lot of stuff, but I wanted to make another couple of points, and I'm going to jump to what some of my last stuff was. Our topic is Me Too, believing in women's equality. And I think it's essential that we remember that Tarana Burke, a black activist from Harlem, launched the Me Too movement a decade ago to aid underprivileged women of color affected by sexual abuse. But black women watched as white women celebrities and others claimed it and erased the beginnings of it. And I think we could talk about, this movement, like, why Me Too now? I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say, I think the Me Too movement, it was Harvey Weinstein, it did come out of kind of the culture of Hollywood, but it has absolutely everything to do with this president and this administration and the movement, the Women's March, and the movement of resistance to this white male hegemony that is entrenching itself and reinforcing itself in so many ways. And we must address the Me Too movement and all the issues of women's equality through the lens of race and class and sexual diversity, as well as gender justice, and make sure that the diverse experiences of women are heard and placed front and center in this particular issue of women's equality. And then lastly, here's my last point. For almost 40 years, the Presbyterian Church has struggled to address the issue of sexual misconduct justly and compassionately. I know from experience that the PCUSA does not function well when sex comes to church. The 1991 Sexuality Report includes chapters on sexual misconduct in the context of all issues of human sexuality that could heal the church, and teaching about what we called a justice love ethic of sexuality that would be taught and learned and promote an ethic of equity and an ethic of dismantling systems of domination. That could help the church heal by helping the church members understand the complexities of sexuality in our time. And I just wanted to read to you what I think is kind of hopeful, even though it was written back in 1991. And this is the way the framework of that report said. As Christians whose deep desire is for justice and love, we find ourselves grateful beyond words for the gift of sexuality and for God's gracious call to be in loving, caring, mutual relation with others. Above all, we are invited to new life in solidarity with the marginalized and the oppressed. In responding to this calling, may God bless and keep us while empowering us, each and all empowering us, to make justice love abound in a world where there is precious little of it. one of my favorite lines in that report. And I just think we need so much work on equity, on our system, our institution, and on sexuality, as the overarching issue of sexuality, as well as sexual misconduct. and what we
Thank
do
you,
about it.
Sylvia. Thank you. Thank you all so much. So we were going to open things up for questions, and maybe you have answers, right? I have a question that maybe somebody would answer. I mean, I'll get to you. You'll be number one. I just want to say one thing that, just to be, in a spirit of authenticity and authentic sharing, whenever I sit on a panel or in a group and people talk about victims, I actually feel physical symptoms. Because for me, what I think of is how much power victims lose. You know, that by declaring yourself a victim, it's almost like you take a power down position in society. And I don't know how somebody who's trying to be a woman leader of a congregation, or really a woman leader of anything, can declare herself, just be honest about her own personal story and declare herself a victim without actually sacrificing a lot of power. So I'm interested in people who have felt a different experience, but haven't, because I think it's very hard to have the credibility and the stature that you need in leading a gender mixed group and take that position of victim, because we live in a blame the victim society, as we've just had some poignant examples. Now, you had a question.
I just want the mic. Oh, I don't think I need the mic. But I just wanted to comment on your problem of creating equality between the sexes. I don't hear preachers preaching on this, and I'm sick of it. And I think we should all go back to our churches and say, I want to hear a series of sermons on equality, because there's still that remnant of the man is the head of the household and the woman is here and she takes care of the children. I mean, it's so ingrained, and even in Presbyterians, that I really think we need to ask our pastors, to preach on this equality, real equality, not the same. We're not the same. We can have different roles, but I don't care if you're LGBT. I don't care, black or white or men or women. We need this sense of equality, and especially in family dynamics, especially and it plays out in the church.
A question about complexity and nuance that some of you mentioned. We understand that sexual abuse is not about sex, but it's about power, which makes me think of entitlement. Exactly. So I guess I'm wondering if people who abuse are dealing with some sort of personality disorder that leads to, and that may or may not be the case. That's sort of a question that I'm partially asking. How does that relate to power and entitlement? I don't know if that question makes sense, but I hope.
So Laurie, do you want to address that?
I heard you take inhale, so I always think when someone inhales, they have.
Well, I mean, what was Rick said, the way you framed that was that those that abuse have some sense of entitlement, but you said it in the like that a personality disorder. Yeah, and this or emotional disorder. Well, we're talking about men and women, but I do think we need to complicate that, because we no longer just talk about men and women. Now we have gender diversity, and we have LGBT, we have sexual diversity, so I think we have to complicate our terms some. But that makes me think, ACWC is talking about what studies they're going to be doing over the next couple of years. And they're going to talk about masculinity. And I think toxic masculinity has to be addressed, whether it's a personality disorder, but the way we raise men to be entitled. And it's within this whole white domination system. It's a white system primarily, and we all are complicit in it in different ways. So I just think we need to unpack this, and I think all of our groups, all the advocacy groups and the advisory committee, we're all looking at how the church needs to start talking about this more, and sexual misconduct is a piece of it.
So, Laurie, the reason I thought you might want to respond to that is because, I mean, there's the individual level, then there's the collective level, then there's the, like, big picture, which Laurie was speaking to about the fact that there weren't even any laws protecting women of color from, you know, and their bodies, right? So it's like, so that's kind of a societal personality disorder, you know, and just that's such a huge systemic issue. Any other, okay, yes.
This isn't meant to be a contradiction, but I'm not sure if it is always just about power. I think it is oftentimes just about sex, as might be in the phrase, men just need to have their needs met, kind of feeling, kind of thinking. One of the more significant books I read while I was a student here at SFTS and Dr. Love's class was The Dark Side of Man by Michael Gigliori, who was a protege of Jane Goodall. And he sort of came to a different conclusion than she did to say, men are inherently violent, and there is a evolutionary propensity for men to want to progenate, to continue their race, and that's always kind of there in the background. And I guess I'm wondering is, I don't know if re-socializing men just to say, okay, treat women equally, or if we really do need to have in place structurally ways to push back against what might be an innate characteristic of men in general. Comments?
Who'd like to take a stab at that? Laurie.
Somebody else wanted to,
Frantz Fanon, who was a psychiatrist and a revolutionary in Algeria, working to free themselves from French colonialism, he said that the struggle is a struggle for power, and it's a struggle to the death. It's a struggle to the death because people want what they want. And then they set up certain people that this not even abuse. It's not abuse when I rape you. It's not abuse when I assault you. It's not abuse when I keep you in a room and prevent you from leaving. It's just boys being boys. It's just beer. It's just, you know, so it's not just a struggle for power. It's a struggle to the death. And because it's a struggle to the death, women cannot wait for men to give them power. Women must seize their power. That's what Fanon would say. You have a cathartic experience, which I think the Me Too movement is kind of a cathartic experience. You come into understanding of your oppression, of your pain, and you seize your power. So I think the seizing of the power that has upset so much the higher levels, of particularly this administration, where they say, oh, listen, my white men friends, we're in danger. We're in danger. We're the ones now who are being victimized because someone is attempting to take our power away from abusing them and treating them any old way we want to. Treating women any old way that we want to. So I don't know what it will take for men to stop war, stop killing people. And it seems like it's not quite right to just say men. Humanity, to stop killing the environment, killing other people. What will it take to do that? It seems like nothing short of the kingdom of God. So I don't really want to work to re-socialize men. I just feel like, men, you're grown. That is just too much work for me. But but that doesn't that we can't have these kind of dialogues, and that we can't have what we need met. And one thing that I think is important is I wish that I could walk down San Anselmo Avenue at midnight and be safe. As a black woman and as a woman, I can't do that. Why can't I do that? Why can't I do that? Because there's a culture of rape. And if I were in downtown San Anselmo at midnight and I were raped, it would be my fault. Yeah. So I would have to reframe your question, because and I think if it's actually not possible to stop rape and war and all manner of evil, then we need to really think about what we're saying at church. I mean, we really need to think about what we're telling people at church. We need to start saying, there's nothing you can do. I'm just going to help you endure your suffering. So you come here, I'm going to give you words to help you endure your suffering. You will never be happy. You will never be safe. God only has minimum ability to affect this world. So let's just all endure together. That is not the message I get from Jesus. And he himself struggled until he died. He struggled to the death. And I think that is really what makes Christianity have this opportunity to transform the world. Because of that, this story of a prophet who struggles to death in a very scandalous way, in a colonized, repressed society, and somehow out of that, life is renewed for some people. I think that's a powerful story, and I think that we have to find a way to tell that story. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a question back.
Thank you.
Who's first? Yeah. No, I wasn't going to speak. I brought that.
Thank you. The issue of violence and how much is related to men, two angles on that coming out of the discussion. In the recent elections, women did fare better, and particularly women who had military records. I'm thinking of Mikey, last name escaping me, in New Jersey. In Amy McGrath coming close to flipping a seat in Kentucky. Women who were, at some level, killers, legitimated killers through the armed forces. The issue of disclosing the violence, revealing the violence, the shadow, when you can't walk down a street, even in San Anselmo, conceivably, in safety at night, that's a revelatory kind of point. And I think the resentment that followed the Kavanaugh hearings was people's resentment at being exposed. And so the pushback and the desire among women, some, white women particularly, to deny that side, that shadow exists. And at least for me, the Christian message, you would say, is to try to expose the shadow and then try to do whatever healing work can be done. But it has to be the de-violencing of the situation. That is the trauma side that comes back, and that's another piece that's been revealed. In that resentment, perhaps the experience of trauma that you're desperately trying to deny. And so I'm just sort of testing those ideas out with you, because it's the resentment piece that gets me. They don't talk about this stuff. And so that for me is a big question.
I'll just come back briefly to the issue. That's a big debate within, there's a whole field of sociobiology that does acknowledge and maybe makes more issue of our biological determinism, that men and women and, people have innate capacities and that men, but I think we have more hope than that. I don't think that, and that's probably the Christian story for me too, that I'm not a biological determinist. I think we're a mix of our biology, but I think socialization is huge. And when we talk about the system in which we live, I've been living in this new learning about this, basically our Western domination system. That's what we live in and breathe in. If you want to read a wonderful book about how we are all complicit in this, read Rita Nakashima Brock and Rebecca Parker's book, Saving Paradise. Yeah, I think it's the best history of the Western world and Christianity and its colonialist, imperialist movement across the world. Not every human being on the earth is raised in the same way that we are to think about power and violence. And so, I would just make that into to Chris's point. I think, in Arizona, we have a very close race. I'm not sure if it's even decided yet between the
McSally's ahead.
McSally's ahead now?
Oh, no, that's right.
Kristen's ahead. But to Chris's point, McSally is a veteran, and all her ads and everything have been, she's a fighter pilot, and that's what she was playing on. Like, governing was better. She could do governing better because of her military experience. Women in this system, in order to get ahead and get into, certainly in the military and other fields, they adopt the patterns. So I think I have a lot of hope that we can unlearn these patterns. And I think our faith has a model for us of destabilizing, breaking across the boundaries, destabilizing the system of power. I'm hopeful.
Liz.
Oh, thank you. Chris, I wanted to bring up something else that you mentioned, and that's the shadow side. So the shadow side of women. So one of the most shocking things for me during this time with Kavanaugh, Me Too movement is the invalidation by other women. The female peers that I have, and actually arguing with female peers about this, it's almost more shocking. It feels like a betrayal, and I'm wondering to what extent you experience that in the church when you're trying to make policy in the church. How many women are you actually trying to debate with?
Anybody get any real pushback from Presbyterian women?
Well, having been on sort of in the trenches with feminist and womanist and Murista theology and queer theology, and especially like reimagining. You say the word reimagining, it's like Kavanaugh. It's like, oh, danger, danger, danger. Women are talking theology. Diverse women are upsetting the structure of theology. Yeah, and oh my gosh, what we got from other, particularly white women. The resistance from conservatives, but white women, I've heard it said that white men put white women out there as their shield. That they are complicit. We are complicit in so many ways. And it's very painful, this conversation that's going on now about white women and their votes and everything they're protecting this shadow side, and they live in fear themselves. Part of it is that some of them are dependent, but they are in marriages, they're relationally and emotionally connected to men, and they know that's protective of them. They don't want to endanger it. And it's complicated.
Yeah. I want to say, too, I think this is a place where we really need to look at our own history as an institution, the theology that we've taught, the ways in which we are complicit with our culture rather than being counterculture. One of the things I saw on Facebook, so I can't tell you who it was or where it came from, but it was a woman who had been raised in a movement that really emerged in the 80s in conservative churches, with notions of being born-again virgins, and it puts all of the emphasis on sexual purity, all of the responsibility on women. And girls are taught from the beginning. So you can't wear shorts, you can't wear sleeveless tops, you can't, if you are assaulted, it is your responsibility because you tempted. And this comes out of the way that we teach the story of Adam and Eve, how we understand what gender means or what God intended. And so until a lot of us would say that's not how what our own theology is, but there's a strong connection between the way our culture thinks and the history of our own, particularly as Presbyterians, our own denomination. And so, to me, part of the response has to come out of what is it that we really believe in? How will we live it? Because I think we can't. Power exists in every human relationship, but I think we need to ask ourselves: if we are in the position of power, how do we use that? What is our responsibility as opposed to what is our entitlement?
I'd like to build on that. I just wonder when the last time people had a conversation about the role of clergy as a position of power. I don't hear that conversation going on. I don't know to what extent clergy are being currently trained to empower laity, or are they complicit in reinforcing a position which makes it almost impossible for laity to challenge them in any way. So I just wonder if that's the conversation we're willing to have.
I think the last thing on this, women being able to unite and to support one another is what some women feel they'll lose, like you're saying. They'll lose the protection they may need from men. But also the struggle between, let's say, racialized women and white women is that racialized women, I would say black women, Asian women, Latino women particularly, become wholly sexual beings as opposed to the purity of whiteness. So if white women become true mutual supportive colleagues, that means that this status where you can both be an activist and be seen as meeting white women's cultural normativity of femaleness that's defined by men. So in some ways, black women are all gender nonconforming because black women have always worked like men. So starting off gender nonconforming, working like men, and then being wholly sexualized so that men with power can have unrestricted access to your body, that is not a life anybody wants. And I can see why there might be some fear for white women to become black women, or to become Latino women, or become immigrant women, or to become Asian women, because of this definition by men. And I feel like women. This gender is a broad category, and women in the West only exist in the imagination of men. The definition of what it is to be female is not female defined, it's male defined. And it's defined by a pretty small segment of the male population. So to lose that, I can remember a time when white women were like, I'm going to work. I'm going back to work. Say like in the 70s and 80s. Black women have been at work for always, but when white women went back to work, women of color took care of their children. I mean, it's all so complicated, and it's all, I can see what's at risk for white women, but also I can see the actual danger they're living in, which I think sometimes it's this coming to consciousness of the actual danger that you're in from living in the shadow of an other defined existence, that you could be abused at any moment.
Or left,
or left, or abandoned, or thrust into poverty, all of that. And women of color have some knowledge about how to deal with that. And it may not look pretty, but we've got some wisdom about
survival.
Yeah, we've got some survival wisdom. So I just want to say that about the challenge, because it is a challenge, and sometimes I really feel empathy for the captivity I see in women who are fighting sort of against their own freedom.
I have a question I'd like to ask.
All right, Sylvia?
Yeah, I have a question, because I think this all is part of this discussion of sexuality that I raised, and then what are clergy talking about the power and sexuality? Here at the seminary, this is one example, one location where we're talking. Do you talk about these things as seminarians and students? Do you talk about sexuality, power dynamics? I'm going to put her on the spot, but Jeanne was telling me about there's a new trans house here, and the complications of gender and male and female and categories and experience of all of this. Are there courses in it deconstructing this white male hegemony? How are you doing here on that? Oops.
Sylvia, they may need to get back to you.
Okay.
Ellen?
As a white American woman, but I'm actually Native American from my mother's side, I look at the gender and the equality issues as a historical. And as I've been here at SFTS, I've seen so much wisdom coming through our professors. So I think there's a tremendous amount of wisdom coming to the table. So I don't think it's hidden. But the discussion needs to be more raw, right? We need to get into the thick of the rawness and the real stories amongst us, and witness the hurt, and witness the wounds, and witness the kind of mobility that we could move as a people. Because Jesus was about witness, right? And he brings our witness to the table. And when we sit at the table, if we don't witness the wound, if we don't witness the heart, what's really going on with each other, we don't really have a place to start. And I think that's where I stand, beside my brothers and sisters in this room, and just say, I really want to get to know you. I want to know you from your heart and what happened to you in your human existence. And then we've got a place to move the issues of climate change, the issues of, all the places that we need to go to, because we don't even get down to the practical rawness with each other.
Go deeper.
So I have one final question as we're wrapping up here, and then I think you'll be lucky enough that you'll be able to come up and speak with the panelists individually for questions that you maybe didn't want to ask at group level. But so I used to be a lawyer, as I think most of you know, right? So I used to be a lawyer, and of course a very big part of what we do in trial law, Reverend Scott Clark over there. We used to talk about our law careers together, right, Scott? Yes. Brewster and Clark, or Clark and Brewster, right? That was our debate, yeah. So of course, very key to any kind of courtroom situation is the jury or the judge has to decide if the witness is telling the truth, right? That's the big deal, right? So, of course, you know, when Kavanaugh gets up there, well, certainly Dr. Christine Blasey Ford got to speak, and then Kavanaugh came in, and it's all, who do you believe, right? And I think that's a really open question in our society right now, is when people come forward and they say, I have been abused, do we just believe because survivors don't share unless it's true? Well, we know that there are false accusations. I mean, we just read recently that women were paid to come forward with accusations that Robert Mueller had sexually abused them. So it is certainly not always true that people who claim abuse are telling the truth. So to whichever of you or all of you who want to answer this question, how do we decide who to believe?
Well, first of all, statistics show that false accusations are less than 7%. So we're not talking huge amounts here. I think we all have to struggle with that, but to struggle with it, we have to look at what is our fear of believing an accuser against the accused. What power does the accused hold over us? What do we stand to lose by believing the accuser? Because often, if we really look at that question, we will find that we have a lot of fear. For good reason.
Yeah.
I'll just add that misogyny is it's a very powerful force of the heart. And so the idea of trusting your heart could lead you astray because of misogyny's power. So the heart would tend to believe the innocence of the one accused because of the power of misogyny. So the fight to me is always to believe or to put credence to or be willing to listen openly to the words of the accuser.
I would say, too, it's been often asked, why would women come forward? Look at what's happening to Dr. Ford. Mm-hmm. She is still being terrorized for coming forward. And the other thing I'd say is, because we talked about the history, women are disproportionately disbelieved, and so they have to overcome that disbelief in doing so. But look at the hearings and what happened. I think when they broke for lunch, the Senate, the people at home watching TV, certainly Mike and me, were believing her. She was so credible. She was low-key. She talked about her pain. She talked about his laughter. I mean, the way she described it, she was so compelling. And how did he come back in the afternoon? Like a bull in a china closet. I mean, he just went out on all barrels of anger. I'm the victim. You are doing this to me. And look at what Anita Hill went through. I mean, how power turns this around and makes themselves the victim. Or like Jeanne says, the statistics show there are some, and that's why I think they certainly have to be tested, to see if they're believable. But women, are disproportionately have to go through tougher hoops in order to be believed.
Did you want to add to that, Teresa?
Just to say that it's another reflection of the imbalance of power in these relationships. And so why would anyone, whether it's a young boy or a woman who's in a position without power, give up what little smidgen they might have in order to make this claim that comes with high risk to them?
Look what happens.
Well, thank you all so much for sticking with this really, really interesting conversation, and let's thank our panelists.